Invasion Audiobook, Parts 18 and 19. Part 18. The forces approached the wood line, preparing for their eventual evening assault, a reconnaissance in force operation to probe the local national militia paramilitary forces of China, who for their part now occupied Butte, the hometown of Joseph and his wife, and many of the other men and their families now with him, who had all managed to escape when the invasion had commenced just the day prior. It was approaching evening on day number 2 of the invasion when the men moved their starting positions for their soon coming mission. Their Chinese opponents, although technically a third-rate Category C, which is a home defense type of unit in China, was still more than effective enough in combat to effectively deal lethal blows necessary to destroy any opposing American forces which still managed to be left on the battlefield. Due to the enormity of the gigantic Chinese forces, both their military and their paramilitary, the Chinese gave the highest priority for their distribution of their best state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry equipment, vehicles, and weapons to their military forces, and of course, their one paramilitary element, the People's Armed Police, before then moving on down the line to their third-rate units of the additional paramilitary elements. In the instance of nighttime capabilities, this meant that national militia units received 2 or sometimes even just 1 set of night vision goggles per squad and 1 set of thermals per squad. Within the active and reserve PLA and other military branches, each and every man had a set of each, unlike the Category C forces. In the case of weapons, many of the paramilitary forces, apart from the People's Armed Police, were frequently armed with surplus passed-down weaponry from the PLA, such as old Type 56 rifles, which were AK-47 clones, instead of the standard QBZ-95s or even the newest QBZ-03s. However, these AK clones were still highly effective considering the types of units they equipped. China, after all, had a total force of 29 million troops. Arming all of them, though having been achieved, would have presented a challenge for any nation on Earth. Despite the size of their forces having had achieved peak production with enlarging their military-industrial complex, they'd soon be able to replace these surplus rifles in a matter of months, as now China was cranking out everything from rifles, machine guns, mortars, light and heavy artillery of rocket and howitzer varieties, and tanks, and of course, every type of additional armored vehicle and associated munition types at a rate never before imaginable. By 2018, China's enormous industrial complexes added to their already sizable industrial base, which put their production capacity up to a point where nothing like it had been seen since, or had been imaginable since, World War II. Only now the products of this massive industrial base were vastly more high-tech and capable than older such weapons, being that it had only been some 5 years since this large addition of capability had been in effect. This was a fairly newer development, although it was now very much adding serious weight to China's military might, already the most powerful nation on Earth with no serious competitors to its hegemony. Within that 5 years, China had pushed their industries to add to their already seemingly endless stockpiles of weaponry and ammo, built up from decades of a relative lack of a need to expend much of it, this being due to China's small conflicts it had prosecuted, the largest of which being their limited incursion into Vietnam in 1979 into 1980. This small-scale minor invasion had taught China many lessons and had spurred on their desires for rapid modernization and advancements in the military sphere, leading to many years of industrial and academic espionage, which led to their huge construction spree of massive factory complexes. As the men sat, they consulted their miniature company leaders, being that only 2 of Joseph's tiny, small, 50-man company elements were to participate in the coming assault, plus 5 men drawn from Joseph's small headquarters company, and he himself present to observe and make changes or corrections to the assault itself. The small advantage that Joseph and his men actually had in this circumstance was the enemy's lack of full-spectrum night vision or IR goggle equipment, in the terms of each and every man of these forces not being equipped with such. Although the enemy may have lacked being totally equipped with night optics and thermal gear, they still possessed enough of it to where they were still genuinely a very perilous opponent, being that each squad still at least had access to some such gear. Moreover, it was a very similar situation on the American side, as some Americans had managed to leave home with different night optics that were available to them, but many still did not. Upon being driven out into nature for refuge, it somewhat evened the odds, however, at least a little bit, that some of the Americans had such equipment, but the enemy still maintained a vast superiority in terms of artillery support, air support, and also raw numbers as well. This, considering that 3 entire Ch1com battalions were now present within and around the town of Butte, including the very headquarters battalion of the entire 4th National Militia Corps, of which 32 overall battalions had comprised this very force, which itself was now spread out throughout the southwestern part of the state of Montana, being assisted by the 27th PAP Light Armored Battalion, itself being a potent fighting force comprised of heavier weaponry than the 4th National Militia Corps even was. These were merely the forces on the Montana side of the state line, as on the other side sat the Russians and other battalions of Ch1coms, having had moved north from lower to the south in Idaho to the state line area to help close in on Americans that were holed up in the mountains. Unbeknownst to Joseph, who himself was unaware of the total size of this massive campaign within the scope of the invasion, still ongoing well into day 2, and perhaps a little longer, as the fighting was heavy and about to become drastically worse. One of Joseph's two attacking understrength companies, as he called them, being merely just 50 men each, was to sneak along an open field just to the north of town as it grew dark and evade detection as long as was humanly possible, and wait there for a messenger to give them the order from Joseph to commence the attack, then return at will to their forest base camp. Completed upon the cessation of the assault that was to only last 20 to 30 minutes tops, to avoid any potential artillery or airstrikes having been called in by the local Ch1com forces by that point. The other company of Joseph's men would attack from the east, striking west, and if done correctly, would potentially achieve a total mission success in learning the strengths and weaknesses of the Ch1com forces and their positions within the area, as well as hopefully making off with Ch1com weapons or equipment. Really, anything of any value to them for the ability to continue to wage war on these new occupation forces now inhabiting their town. Butte was now owned by the Chinese, but the hinterlands would be a challenge to tame and bring to heel for any occupier. Really, not all that different from Afghan. However, part of the very reason why these lighter Ch1com home defense troops were even allocated to the area was for the very reason that they'd be more effective forces when conducting mountain warfare, due to their lighter vehicles, and that these troops had often trained in Sichuan and the Himalayan plateau regions of China, being used to higher altitudes, able to follow Americans up into their lofty hiding places, thus being well acclimated during the training back in China. Listen, you men be ready. I have Robbie here as my runner, who will pass along my orders. Listen to me, and you listen good. This is our first mission as a reorganized and hurriedly trained partisan-like element. Everyone better stick to plan and not deviate from it. I'm counting on you as the company commanders to keep your men focused on task and under your control, in order that they fight exactly the way they were trained. For all it's worth, I completely get it. We weren't able to train them as long as realistically required for their muscle memory to instinctively take over in a combat situation. I'd have loved to have had days to get these men ready. Truly, weeks would have been best. But who knew this shit would even happen? And we'd be in such a position. Just wait for my runner. You go re-explain the plans to your men and fully brief them. And just sit tight until Robbie makes it to you. Head out to your company, stated Joseph to Adam, the leader of First Company of Joseph's men. Roger that. I got you. We served, but many of these guys haven't. I hope they don't disappoint or break and run. Our families depend on their abilities to be able to take the heat and stand and fight in the face of what we are staring down. I'm headed out now, responded Adam, the commander of First Company. I'm gone too. I'll be awaiting your orders upon briefing my guys too, added Charles, the commander of 2nd Company. Okay, remember to get in, hit fast and hard, do as much damage as you can, and tell your men to take mental notes of all that they observe or see while conducting the assault. After all, this is a recon enforce mission, so the recon part is what matters the most. But make sure gear and weapons are also a priority. If our men can get to them before the Ch1coms can retrieve their dead and their equipment. Look, I know it might be extremely difficult, but if you can, take prisoners. Any who can be taken whatsoever at all, no matter how it's done, need to be taken for potential intelligence gathering purposes. Yeah, Joseph, but we ain't got no Mandarin fluent guys, responded Adam as he turned to head out to his awaiting men to brief them. We will find someone. It's only a matter of time, yelled Joseph in a somewhat muffled yell to try to stay unheard by anyone who might somehow be within earshot, although, however, still unlikely where he sat, currently positioned. Despite the unlikelihood of it, nobody knew where any potential Ch1com foot patrols might be. Charles heard and also acknowledged the order, as he went to his men to brief them as well. From where Joseph, Robbie, and the 4 others of the headquarters company now sat in the fulcrum of the assault forces positions, with the northern forces to their right side facing to the south and the western facing forces to their front if they were looking south toward the west facing eastern side of the attack. Joseph told the other 4 men to prepare to head into the battle zone to pick up the wounded, but leave the dead due to the inability to get both the wounded and the dead, as the wounded obviously mattered the most. The other 4 men were essentially the ambulance/medivac forces tasked out for the wounded retrieval forces, not quite medics per se, but more like the old-fashioned simple stretcher bearers, simply there to evacuate the wounded on the backs of their ATVs to the forest where the medical staff from town originally would attend to them. Their ATVs were indeed set up for such a task, each with a long wooden plank strapped down to the back, where each of the 4 ATVs could potentially carry 2 wounded laying down apiece, or 8 total at a time for all 4 ATVs. This was essentially the ability to evacuate almost nearly a full squad at a time, if it were necessary. Being that their forest base camp wasn't especially far away, merely several miles from the town itself, it was indeed feasible that they could make several runs back and forth for this mission, if necessary, due to moderate casualties, should it occur in such a way. They would indeed be needed, and the first mission appeared to be a potentially rocky one at best. The fighting men picked up some training, but merely a day's worth was practically minuscule in terms of the types of rigorous combat training needed to have a fully effective infantry type of fighting element. No, rather, these men would learn by sheer experience, with many ending up learning harsh lessons in this regard, as they'd see a side of warfare unimaginable for both its overall brutality, but also its finality, pushing them to realize that potential fatality was around the corner and could come at any moment, forcing them to rapidly adapt to these conditions or perish out of a failure to do so. There was only one chance when learning by experience, as one failure could mean the proverbial end of the line, so to speak. It was now dark, and Joseph, the overall nominal commander of his 250-man strong forces, told Robbie to get on his dirt bike and spread the orders to move out. Robbie acknowledged his given command to act, and in order to maintain a much more quiet travel to execute his command as a messenger for communications, allowing for coordination among the forces, purposely drove his dirt bike further back from behind the forces to prevent the buzzing sound made by the dirt bike from being heard by any potential enemy forces patrolling the areas. Due to the hilly, wooded terrain of the foothills and valleys in the area, this strategy of maintaining messenger silence as opposed to so-called radio silence seemed to work somewhat effectively. The hills above the town of Butte, heading into a downward slope populated by forest, opened up into fields on the lower hillsides leading into the town. It truly was a beautiful landscape of breathtaking terrain, but it had been earlier shelled and pummeled with heavy airdropped ordnances from the first attempt at raiding the town for supplies, which ended up being only partially effective. However, that was due in large part to the very small forces at the time of holding the CCP supply base within the town, as larger forces had redeployed to the northeast and away from the town to occupy and clear other areas elsewhere. Upon the 75th National Militia Corps having moved out, with the 4th quickly moving in to replace them earlier. That created the small window by which the Americans had made their supply run into the town. Now, however, the real test was about to commence. The men were all gung-ho and definitely had heart. But this would be a very real do-or-die test. Robbie gave the order to Adam to start the raid with a quiet, or at least attempted quiet, raid coming from the north, headed southbound, within 10 more minutes, by which time Robbie should have made it just on time to give Charles the go order as well, who was commanding the forces that were attacking west from their eastern position, in overall forces being in a general L-shape formation. Robbie flew by behind Joseph and the 4 stretcher-bearer men, now en route to Charles. The buzzing sound, quasi-muffled, as he passed further uphill, zipping and zooming and dipping through the hilly terrain and natural ditches and ravines. He then had, of course, reached Charles by that point, who began to lead his men forward. Joseph was a very wise leader and understood how vital organization, communication, and coordination truly was in the sense of leading his forces within the scope of their operations. Logistically, he was doing the best he could as well, having had organized earlier the various ammunition types according to caliber and class, whether rifle/machine gun ammo, pistol ammo, or shotgun ammo. His men were all laden down with enough ammo to be able to carry out their relatively short, quick action mission, now in the process of being conducted. They all carried as much as they could, without obnoxiously weighing themselves down to where it would slow them down substantially or make too much noise from running and other movements. They were moving with a purpose, as ordered, exactly as planned. The men hugged the ground, camouflaged amid the tall grasses, all of varying heights. Some patches as high as 4 foot tall, whereas others were merely 2 or so feet in height. The men would run crouched low when moving, and upon getting in closer, would crawl in the prone position were it possible for them to get within range of the actual town limits themselves, safely, without discovery. Being a night operation, it was well understood that large quantities of local Ch1com forces would thus be either asleep or experiencing potential downtime to recuperate from the war thus far, all while leaving a relatively smaller guard force for roving patrols or to man the various strong points and hardened positions throughout the town and its immediate vicinity. Included in such would be various machine gun nests or barriers that would consist of different vehicles or converting certain buildings themselves into fortified positions. Joseph sat upon his all-terrain vehicle, but pledged to move in with the men due to the stretcher bearers also being called upon to rapidly move in once the shooting began for retrieving any potential wounded. Joseph, however, was going to move in even prior to them, moving alone in relation to the 2 different companies now moving ahead, one moving south and one moving west. He should be relatively safe as he began to move downhill and out of his wooded cover and into the tall grasses with scattered rocks in the immediate path he chose to crouch and walk through. He had his night vision monocle optic. He observed all the men moving in their wedge formations. They got it down. They're actually doing it correctly, Joseph thought to himself as he beamed with happiness at their accomplishment thus far. But could they maintain their current discipline once actual combat began? Joseph had truly hoped so. However, thus far, they were doing what they were trained to do in terms of the very basic tactical formation movements. He continued to creep forward and down the hilly sloping field of tall grasses, which gave him some cover in the nighttime conditions. He now could see some Ch1com foot patrols as he observed his men moving closer towards the town as well, nearing a road on the west-facing attacking forces, while the men on the north-facing south route were also moving toward another road, which made its way winding out of town and up into the hills, moving in a somewhat zigzag pattern as it headed in a northwesterly direction out and away from town. The Ch1com foot patrols were fairly numerous, as they were obviously guarding the outer perimeters of the town itself. He was able, from his position, to be able to observe the inside of the town as well, from his position as he stood fully up in the tall grass to gaze down into it. There were trucks all over the town, and also Tiger MRAPs as well, and some of the Ch1com EQ 2050 armored vehicles and VP scout cars. There were also machine gun nests and also even mortar pits. Essentially, standard mortar tubes protected by sandbag emplacements. The Ch1com supply base property was visible also. That had formerly been operated by the PLA supply company belonging to a larger battalion within a parent unit within the 7th Group Army of the PLA. They'd redeployed, whereby the HQ battalion of the 4th National Militia Corps now maintained the installation on the CCP property as their own headquarters installation for its entire corps. Roughly 3,000 men occupied the area of Butte, but Joseph needed to know how many of these three battalions he knew were in the Butte area were actually within the town itself. Otherwise, if some were spread out, he likewise would need to know exactly where they were, because they could become a very dangerous foe in any potential future scenario whereby they could maneuver in such ways that could pin down or even envelop he and his forces, something Joseph needed to ensure would not occur for he and his men's own sake. All the forces moving south, coming from the north, and moving to the west, coming from the east, all inched closer and closer. There was now a Ch1com foot patrol of one squad moving perpendicular to the road on the east side of town, about to proceed across it. Just as a few wedges had suddenly dropped, obviously trying to avoid outright detection. Joseph was pleased as he observed all of this through his optics. He had explicitly ordered that the men get as close to the town itself as conceivably possible, and into it, if it could even be done. It was asking a lot, as security was obviously very tight, with now the other forces to the north that were southbound were now also about to run into other Ch1com patrols. They too had moved quietly and dropped upon hearing or seeing Ch1coms, as there were some Americans with night or thermal optics of their own who were strategically thus spaced out within the squads to optimize their effectiveness, ensuring that nearly each squad at least had someone to guide the rest, who therefore did not have any such optics. This ended up being a real blessing, as by now both groups were now each within 200 meters of the town proper. There were a set of machine gun nests and armored Shangji trucks at every entryway into the town in terms of the roads leading in and out. The Ch1com foot patrols would end up needing to be dealt with eventually, lest they end up as a sort of harassing force, intercepting the men upon their retreat from town and possibly even following them into the hills. This would be an unacceptable outcome, as that would prove perilous beyond all measure. Hence, the foot patrols would be hit upon reaching the town limits, along with also any machine gun nests and positions proving possible to outflank in some sort of ways. Some men carried Molotovs, which could annihilate or at least cripple vehicles and even do irreparable harm to personnel themselves by inflicting serious burns. But if it were even possible, hand grenades or even a single mortar tube and some mortars would be a hell of a score for this one raid. However, the weight of the base plate and mortar tube while trying to flee on foot would present oneself as an easy target while attempting to do so. The men now were reaching some of the outermost buildings on the northern end of town, being a group of trailers and several homes with decently sized yards. On the eastern end, it was a ranch and some brick buildings, which were former shops and several regular homes intermixed within them. Joseph now placed his optic onto his Springfield 30-06, tightening it onto the Picatinny rail system he had customized his rifle with. He now aligned his sights, ready to offer fire support as a sharpshooter. He now was waiting for the inevitable. He knew the CCP property was on the westernmost part of town, but it was drastically well fortified, and heavily so, for the logistical supplies already there, but also due to the communications equipment now set up for the 4th Corps Headquarters Battalion, who was now occupying the site. It began, and now he pulled the trigger, having it actually trained his rifle sights onto a machine gunner in the nest on the eastern end of town, smacking him in the head with a round. Having adequately calculated the drop of the round and the distance of the shot from his rough elevation, he was a damn good shot and hit his mark. Upon the sudden strike into the machine gunner, his head snapped back as blood flew instantaneously out of the exit wound, with the sheer force of impact also whipping some out of the entry wound as well. It was all so fast, as Joseph soon even heard the very first shot go off. He was already in action, having provided his sharpshooting support. Now he aimed at the next mark, the assistant machine gunner in the same machine gun nest, who had himself jumped onto the machine gun upon pushing the corpse of his dead comrade off to the side. Too little, too late. Joseph sent another round downrange, hitting the assistant machine gunner in his left shoulder, blasting out bone matter and muscle and skin tissue with ample amounts of blood. The now wounded Ch1com paramilitary soldier was now out of commission. He began to scan for other targets immediately thereafter. As he did, he could see fire illuminate the ground throughout the east end of town and also the north end of town. The foot patrols from earlier had largely been wiped out in the ensuing firefight. But unfortunately, Joseph was unaware that many of his men were already KIA'd as well, with multiple already wounded within minutes of the skirmish itself starting to break out. He looked through his monocle and seen Ch1com's bounding and covering, leapfrogging from building to building, not stopping anywhere within his view, and moving far too fast to hit with his single-shot bolt action. Yes, he would need to shift positions and try to give cover elsewhere, if he could. He began to watch for other possible Ch1com foot patrols that could be moving in to cut off the escape routes and otherwise attempt some kind of envelopment of his men. Something his men had already been briefed on and told how to avoid it by using simple tactical formations such as the diamond formation if caught in smaller groupings, or even star formations, and perhaps maintaining simple wedges for counter-assault breakthroughs of enemies attempting to cut them off, depending upon if they, of course, were being pursued from behind or not. The men fought hard, mere minutes in. By now, it had only been 10 minutes. Despite that, it was going from an infantry on infantry skirmish to one where it began to see use of heavier weaponry. One of the armored Sgt trucks had been Molotoved and already crippled, but others had swung into action. The turret gunners from the armored cab turrets were laying down heavy 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire, as well as the Tiger MRAPs beginning to show up doing similar. Among other weapons, such as the use of mortars, which acted as their own light artillery support forces, causing immense devastation. "Robbie, sound retreat!" screamed Joseph as he finally found another target, a group of Ch1coms from one of the other foot patrols on the perimeter, having just had shown up. Due to his height on higher terrain, he was able to pick off two of the squad members of the foot patrol right below him, causing them all to open fire on his position, save one who was checking to see if Joseph had KIA'd or simply just wounded the two men that were hit. Already the stretcher bearers had done their job well, but had been exceedingly overwhelmed in so doing. It wasn't that Joseph had a bad plan, it was the men executing it, and the enemy having drastically more powerful weaponry, even for a light third-rate unit like the 4th National Militia Corps of China was. Now, before even the 20-minute mark, it was time to rapidly pull out. Joseph knew this would be extremely dangerous of an operation, but as a recon in force, it needed to be done because this was his former hometown, plus it also was the 4th's entire headquarters battalion itself being present within it, plus the other two truck infantry battalions for added additional manpower and protection of it. The men now conducted a fighting retreat as planned and as trained to do. It seemed through the optics that there were many who immediately got the picture. They fought in their tactical formations and maintained discipline, and also spread out and avoided being clustered too close together, whereby they could be annihilated by incoming mortar strikes. Also, they moved with a quickness, fully understanding that air or artillery strikes from the big guns and ground attack aircraft would soon be inbound to wipe them all out should they linger around and not flee the battle space. Finally, the surviving forces reached the woods and continued all the way to their base camp, as the wood line itself would also likely be hit as well, as it was relatively close to the town, and Ch1com forces might assume that the Americans would still possibly be there within that area. Joseph had found Adam and Charles amid all the retreating men, many having had managed to acquire some Ch1com gear and weapons off of the deceased, mostly being from the foot patrols further out away from the town, as they were easier to reach than the Ch1coms within the town limits themselves, which unfortunately the Ch1coms held the town with minimal issues, as the Americans couldn't penetrate effectively, despite having crippled 2 Chinese vehicles and managing to take out 2 machine gun nests, one having been attributed to Joseph's on-point accuracy as a sharpshooter. Despite having essentially achieved its main goals, the casualties sustained were fairly moderate. Of the 100 men that had participated in the assault on Butte, there were 30 KIA'd and 28 WIA'd, the wounded in action. Fortunately, the ambulance all-terrain vehicles did make quick runs to the rear to drop off the wounded, being able to make 2 trips within the short, roughly 20-odd minute span. One trip from 5 minutes in, and one while retreating with the others during the general retreat from the area. There were 7 ambulatory wounded who could walk, but the other 5 wounded had been captured due to not being able to be retrieved. Although there was no way for the Americans to do a battle damage assessment themselves and see what actually had occurred to enemy forces, they'd managed to make a psychological impact on the local Ch1com forces, having had struck hard and quickly, taking out 20 Ch1coms and seriously wounding 45 others. They'd managed to acquire some Ch1com body armor, helmets, and small arms with ammo, grenades, and even some night optics. Roughly some 3 pairs of NVGs were managed to be taken. They also were able to get 4 light machine guns amid their small arms acquisitions. The men also got a good up-close look at the town's defenses and generally could see which buildings were being used as barracks, as well as how thick the forces were within the town limits themselves, something Joseph's men could never hope to overcome, at least not in the current configuration they were in, whereby their forces were large and closely grouped together. They were very dangerous in that alignment, but soon Joseph was able to set up a successful ambush operation for the more distant patrols, as well as create a more specialty force to later infiltrate the town undiscovered and be able to inflict maximum damages while doing so. This, however, would take some more time to achieve, as his forces would need to recover and proverbially lick their wounds and reconfigure themselves again due to the heavy casualties they had just sustained. Attrition was unfortunately a massive part of these sorts of wars, whereby guerrilla forces typically suffer horribly in terms of the sheer attrition sustained, as opposed to dished out on the professional military or paramilitary forces that are their opponents. The men were totally sprinting now towards their earthen bunkers, earlier having been prepared at their base camp, as within several more minutes, shells began to crash into the forest, just as Joseph had correctly anticipated they would. And most likely, so would the accompanying air power, which itself would be shortly coming to add to the destruction as well. Thus far, it seemed to be a sort of routine area denial strike as it pertained to the artillery. As Joseph and his men got in, and they hit as fast and hard as they could before rapidly melting away as planned. His men and himself now reached their bunkers as the shelling began intensifying. There was a head count conducted to ensure that everyone who had survived their recon and force operation had thus made it safely underground, as the company sub-commanders of Joseph's forces had made sure that none of their men maybe got lost while trying to return, or, worse yet, maybe had been caught and eliminated by an artillery shell. Flashlights and candles, many having been retrieved the day prior in their barely successful supply raid into town, fortunately had been enough to light their underground bunker systems, including the flashlights now having ample batteries that would last for some time, where they lit the new primitive underground bunkers of the earthworks fairly adequately. Amid the head count, shells intensified in their cacophony of chaos above. Fortunately, none had managed to score any direct hits on any particular primitive bunkers dug earlier. But some did come close enough to where many ended up being covered in dirt as the ground shook violently, and those wearing whatever head protection they had available fared the best, as those who lacked such had to basically cover their heads with their arms to protect from falling rocks or clumps of earth. Being underground was by far the best way to avoid not only the concussive blast waves of the munitions landing, but their shredding shrapnel fragments as well. For nearly 2 hours, the shelling raked all throughout the forest in a methodical shift away from the vicinity of their bunkers, trenches, and foxhole systems to cover a wide, broad swathe of territory due to the fire missions being called in, not having any direct coordinates to fire upon, thus being used in this case as an area saturation weapon in the case of the current barrage. Soon before the barrage had ended, one squadron of 12 JH-7 ground attack aircraft had been scrambled from their aerodrome once they'd been equipped for their ground strike mission on the area of this forest. Each aircraft broke off to hit a specific area, dropping 10 tons of ordnance per aircraft onto their designated target area. Once it all finally ceased and everything had basically quieted down, Joseph had also anticipated the next issue they'd soon face. Already aware of it since the start of the operation that had been conducted earlier, the local forces would have been planning their own assault missions to scour the forests and local wildlands to hunt down the Americans. And he had apparently stirred the pot, having made them livid to the point of a savage air and artillery reprisal attack in an attempt to wipe them off the face of the earth. Had he not been in charge, and perhaps another man with identical plans would have carried them out without the underground bunkers dug first, whereby they could retreat into, it had all been over and done with, considering the massive size of the retaliatory blows. No doubt would the local Ch1com forces be coming soon. But it was a question of how soon, and if they'd be acting according to plans they'd had in the works already anyways, or if they'd be coming up with one on the fly, being more flexible in their approach. Joseph had no way to know who the local corps commander of all these paramilitary troops even was, or if the National Militia 4th Corps of Chinese paramilitary planned their specific operations. However, he had achieved his recon in force and acquired small amounts of weapons and gear. It wasn't much, but it was a start. His next plan would be far more audacious and involve smaller, stealthier forces. This due to the Ch1coms obviously raising their overall security status and alert level within the town, thereby eliminating any realistic future opportunity to even do a similar sized assault there with a similar size or larger forces in numbers. Indeed, he would definitely require a smaller, much more specialized force. Something more akin to a partisan special operations force, if it could even be called such a thing. In the meantime, however, it would be time to move immediately, as in time now. Ch1coms would be inbound, as again he was aware how these things worked. But he didn't know how soon, and he wasn't going to risk the lives of his men or his family or their families as well. He also knew he needed to make contact with the forces earlier encountered by the scouting element he had sent out to look for other Americans, thereby to be able to combine forces with them. This simply being a matter of survival by the strength in numbers doctrine. The 300 that had been discovered now in the mountains just north of Bozeman, but just to the southeast somewhat of Joseph's group, had been contacted with their leader aware that Joseph planned to link up with his group. Now would definitely be the time to do it, in Joseph's mind, being that staying in the area would no longer be safe for sure, but he could potentially return with his group at a later time. It was getting cold, and for the time being, the bunker complexes seemed drastically warmer, with everyone huddled up in their winter gear, blankets, and sleeping bags. He sure hated to do it, but it had to be done. "Get up!" Everyone, time to move. We gotta move. Robbie, go let all the commanders know to get their men in gear. We gotta get the hell out of here. It won't be safe here soon. They'll be looking for us. He yelled as he peered out of the bunker entryway in the one in which he currently found himself. Even without peering through his night vision monocle, he could tell the forest had been completely leveled by numerous amounts of shells and airdropped munitions. Seeing much of the canopy missing entirely, and the shadows of what trees had been ripped apart or in total shreds being knocked down to their sides or tilted nearly all the way over. It was a total disaster area. Miles away, in the Derby area, near the state line, a massive battle in the mountains was now underway. And Bill, Brian, and others have been engaged in combat, albeit at as safe of a distance as their rifles could possibly allow. However, many of their shots couldn't hit their marks, as the combat in the thick, mountainous, forested terrain was becoming a hellish experience whereby many armed civilian combatants were thoroughly unprepared to conduct a defense against a well-trained and organized force with drastically more discipline as well, not to mention weapons and communications equipment, giving them an edge over the Americans. One thing in the defenders' favor, however, was the terrain itself, prohibiting enemy vehicles from higher altitudes or deviating far off of roads, and relegating the much heavier vehicles, by and large, to valleys and lower altitudes, making the erupting battle largely between two conflicting infantry forces. Although only one had artillery and air support, whereas the other did not. Bill and Brian stuck together, running and shooting, and running more, place to place. It was comparable to bounding and covering, but not in a leapfrogging manner, and with or without any sort of covering fire, seemingly being quite lackluster, as these were regular civilians that were not tactically educated. However, being that these men were not the most tactically aware, much less educated in such maneuvering, they did do their best, all things considered. Rang shots of various rifles, as there were Ch1com forces and Americans exchanging shots as the Chinese forces charged up the sloping terrain, attempting to get higher and higher up into the mountains. Many of these light truck infantry forces from the 4th National Militia Corps made very good, adept mountain warfare forces due to all their training conducted in the mountains of Sichuan province as well as the Himalayan plateau in Tibet. They could run up the slopes without gasping for breath due to the thinner air, as they were well acclimated to mountain fighting. The Americans were getting smacked down by the machine guns and rifles of the attacking Ch1com forces, along with Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade ammo, typically the anti-personnel fragmentation rockets. There were heavier weapons employed as well, such as mortars and anti-tank missiles, as well as incoming sporadic artillery and airstrikes, often being called in on specific trouble spots. Those who failed to move perished by far the quickest. Essentially, anyone who stayed in one spot for too long had shells or mortars land upon them, or sometimes even an air-to-ground missile or free-fall ordnances dropped by ground attack aircraft. Bill had seen the bloodied, mangled bodies of those who suffered such fates, causing he and Brian to learn quickly to move around with a quickness, all the while continuing to withdraw into the higher altitudes of the mountains. They had lost access to their all-terrain vehicles, which had been destroyed by machine gun fire ripping through them while they were abandoned due to the initiation of combat erupting all around them, causing both Bill and Brian to quickly abandon them and drop down to the ground to avoid being cut down by a hail of rounds. Others who were with them at the time had been torn up while still sitting on their ATVs, having had been taken by total surprise by attacking enemy forces, having had gotten the drop on them at one point. Earlier, they'd been perched near a cliffside overlook above a windy mountain road, planning to ambush another Ch1com convoy or patrol using the road below them. However, other Ch1com battalions had disembarked their vehicles, hiking and climbing up the mountainsides to flank the Americans and conduct their assault up into the mountains. Mortars now flew in as Brian fired his AR at the attacking Ch1coms just below them, now charging uphill, taking cover behind large boulders or dropping to the prone while bounding and covering if there were no suitable cover and concealment available for the Ch1coms. The standard Type 56 rifles of the National Militia paramilitary troops were largely somewhat ineffective beyond 400-meter ranges, but they were only 250 meters maximum just below them and moving up and closing in upon them. They also had light squad machine guns managing to lay down heavy bursts, such as the Type 81 light machine guns, as opposed to the Type 81-1 rifles, that also equipped some of the other types of third-rate paramilitary troops, as opposed to the huge military, which had all the top-tier weapons and equipment, all the state-of-the-art militaria, with only the PAP as the only paramilitary unit receiving other newer equipment. However, these passed-down, hand-me-down weapons were still sufficient enough and were laying waste everywhere. Another man off to the left of Bill and Brian as they ran got smacked down by a burst of 7.62 by 39 millimeter ammunition as it hit his unprotected stomach, chest, and head all in one go, moving from bottom to top, likely due to the climb rate of the light machine gun as it was fired. Splashes of rounds smacked into the rocky soil or hit trees, knocking wood fragments and splinters out of them, filling the air with debris. It was a loud steady rattling of various small arms, and also occasional grenade, rocket, mortar, and artillery shells blasting in various areas. Fortunately, the artillery was relegated for the time being as a more precision strike weapon and not an area saturation / terrain denial weapon, allowing for vastly easier chances of survival, so long as one stayed moving. Major emphasis placed on the aforementioned statement. Despite this being the case for now, unfortunately, some attempting to do just that would still be wounded or cut down entirely, even while moving. Bill himself witnessing a man being basically clotheslined by a round smacking into his neck, blowing out the back of his brainstem, killing him instantly, dropping him like a sack of potatoes, nearly severing his head in so doing. Men screamed in pain among the wounded, with non-combatant civilians bravely trying to act as on-the-spot medics or stretcher bearers, the latter being those who lacked any sort of formal medical training but wanted to do their part to help the situation and make some kind of a difference. This overall experience revealed the true character of people, meaning whether they had heart or were completely spineless cowards, insofar as the able-bodied men present were concerned. Bill turned and fired his rifle, once again missing his mark, largely due to having a bolt rifle and not being able to fire it accurately while moving, which was something that took ample training and practice and/or experience to become completely proficient in. Brian continued to fire, and he was only able to hit 2 Ch1coms, although only hitting their body armor in the sappy plate areas. Was unable to actually do them any sufficient harm beyond causing them sharp pain in their ribs. Continually moving back up the mountain, they reached a road which laid at a higher elevation, coming into groups of people running towards a mountain home which sat upon this very road, only for it to then be dive-bombed by one of the Russian Su-35s, which were tasked out to this specific area's airspace, swooping down, dropping a 500-pound munition onto the home, throwing enormous amounts of building materials, black smoky debris, and white smoke mixed in with all kinds of shrapnel in every direction within a 360-degree pattern. Bill was knocked back, not from the blast itself, being relatively safely far away enough from its radius, but from the sheer noise and intensity of the blast being still somewhat close enough to where it shocked his senses and confounded him momentarily, as well as others who were also close enough for this type of effect to take hold of them, while also still being at a still relatively safe distance away from it. The area was systematically being cleared as enemy forces were beginning to close in, moving up the mountain on all sides, unbeknownst to Bill or the roughly 1,000 other citizens living within this small section of the mountains along the state line just to the southwest of Derby, Montana. Armed civilian fighting forces were becoming trapped within a large pocket, whereby 10 battalions of the 4th Ch1com National Militia Paramilitary Corps, with 2 PAP battalions moving north from the Idaho side of the state line, with also, or from the 21st PAP Light Armor Brigade, with also 1 Russian armored battalion on the Idaho side, blocking the direct west escape routes at the base of this section of the mountains. Also, with Chinese and Russian artillery support on either side of the state line, and the allocated Russian air power patrolling this section of battle space during the invasion. Day 2 was nearing an end, and the darkness of the skies were illuminated by tracer ammunition blasts and fires created by the occasional napalm strikes via such napalm tanks being dropped by the ground attack aircraft, lighting large areas of the forest aflame. While being corralled in such a way, the Americans still continued to put up a hell of a fight, relatively speaking. Fighting uphill is never easy, even for a well-equipped and trained force, because mountains are still mountains at the end of the day, which make excellent natural defensive fortresses for those within them. Earlier on day 2, other created pockets that lay to the southeast along the state line, closer more towards I-15, had been destroyed in a similar manner to what was occurring now where Bill and Brian were. But the Americans in those pockets were in much smaller groupings, and also within mountains that lay somewhat lower in altitude, comparatively speaking. Apart from these pockets, there was one also directly to the north, whereby Russian forces closed in on the western side, and Chinese forces of the 4th, also of the 4th Militia Corps, closed in on the eastern side, which had also then liquidated that pocket earlier in the day. This, where Bill and Brian were, was the last known pocket and was now closing in fast. The battle here was especially intense due to the sheer numbers involved, deployed on both sides. There also was an attempt to create yet another big pocket directly southeast of this last one in which Bill was trapped, as several thousand Americans roamed those other mountains, and Chinese forces attempted to also corral them and contain them, although they had ultimately failed to do so. Regardless, however, they'd managed to annihilate 3/4 of the Americans found there just to the southeast of Bill's pocket, causing the rest to quietly and rapidly slip away, all with the intent to continue the fight as a partisan outfit against the occupation. None of that had any bearing, however, upon Bill's current situation, as he, like most others in the state line area, had literally no idea of one another, as communications and awareness of other areas and associated happenings there was simply unavailable. And thus was such general awareness impossible for anyone who fell on the American side of things. "We gotta get the hell out of here, man!" screamed Brian. With seconds later, rounds smacking the ground around him 50 meters from where Bill and Brian currently were. Two then managed to catch Brian in the leg, causing him to yelp in agony upon chunks of flesh, muscle, and femur bone being blown out. It was indeed a life-threatening wound, especially if no one could reach Brian with any sort of medical attention fast enough. Brian, Bill, help! We need medical help now! Yelled Brian, freaking out behind seeing all the gore of his leg being injured in such a severe manner. Bill then began to yell for help as well. Bill, being a common civilian, knew nothing of combat first aid procedures and turned to fire 2 quick shots before reloading his bolt rifle. Bill then realized he was running low on ammo as he dropped into the prone position to then fire his last 5 rounds. "I'm running out of ammo!" yelled Bill in a legitimate sense of fear and urgency, with a level of anxiety intermixed, largely due to the uncertainty of the situation. "God help me," said Bill to himself, and he meant it. Brian was by this point badly bleeding out and going into shock. Some women ran over to him amid all the fire. 4 of them. One woman was a nurse at the local clinic. 2 of the others were CNAs, and one was simply the sister of the nurse there to assist in helping the wounded. They managed to get to Brian amid all the small arms fire and carefully elevated him onto a sling and got him out after rapidly tourniqueting the wound due to the lack of other options, as the severity of the blood loss presented little other options. Fortunately, Brian's rifle was a hindrance to his rescue, as it was simply unnecessary weight to carry for these women. And the rifle had been left with 3 of its magazines for Bill, who rolled over to the rifle as he lay on the ground and picked it up with the 3 mags while leaving his now empty bolt rifle, his former hunting rifle, as it no longer had any ammo. And the AR was by far more suitable of a rifle for the current circumstances as they now presented themselves. Besides that, an empty rifle in this terrain was basically pointless additional weight to haul around in these conditions. In the high altitude and rough topography as it stood, he physically was already worn out, not being in proper shape for combat, simply running on pure adrenaline. But regardless, his body was now reaching its limits. He began to fire with still other Americans in other positions that were still scattered about, who continually fired as well. Some moved, while others were annihilated by mortar fire as the ordnances flew down upon them and sent up surges of concussive blasts and white smoke with dirt and debris, along with their bodies. The situation was getting more and more dire, and the Ch1com infantry forces continually charged uphill, bounding and covering, leapfrogging in rapid succession, stopping briefly to take cover. Occasionally, one or two was taken out here and there, but the attrition rate remained relatively lopsided, with the Americans bearing the brunt of the casualties in this battle. Everything seemed to Bill like it was all happening in slow motion, with his body's movements seemingly much faster than his brain could even process. This being due to the adrenaline and his fight-or-flight reflexes all kicked into high gear. After all, the reality of the fast-paced situation was one where people were cut down insanely rapidly in a very fast-paced combat situation. It was simply that Bill's brain perceived it all slower than the actual raw realities of it. He rolled behind the road now, from having had been on the road, and continued to be laying in the prone position from his new position on the side of the road, shooting from behind a lower grade of elevation on the other side of the road, allowing him to stay relatively low, but hit a Ch1com point man of an attacking squad in one of the wedge formations, peeking now into view from below the slope to where they could just now be seen. The shot hit the Ch1com troop in his helmet, but at a glancing blow to where it knocked him down by the force of impact near the side of his head, likely grazing him as the round ripped through the Kevlar of the helmet at close range. Others in that same wedge formation, upon their point man being hit, all instantly dropped for cover, and within a second later, 2 hand grenades flew up towards the road. This having had come from the others within that particular squad that was in the attacking wedge formation. Bill got up and ran immediately to his left, and thereafter rounds began to fly his way, as behind him the grenades now blasted, and tracer rounds pursued him, with rounds in general splashing everywhere around him and near him, causing him to once again drop for cover behind another section of the road. Upon getting down for cover, he fell upon the body of an earlier KIA'd American unarmed civilian who had been shot up badly in many parts of his body, turning him into a hamburger meat-looking sort of figure in the dark. Bill was truly blessed. It was dark, and he didn't have to fully see all the gory, disgusting, nasty details of this current battlefield. Just then, anti-personnel fragmentation rockets flew over his head and crashed into an embankment further behind him. He had no way to know if that was directed towards him or anybody else, as it was total pandemonium by this point. All Bill knew was the enemy was coming up towards the road, apparently in sizable numbers, as the withering firepower was taking its toll, and Americans were being forced further up the mountain, whether they were ready for it or not. It was a poorly coordinated defense, And the only thing that even allowed for it to be even quasi-coordinated without any formal sense of command and control or any leadership whatsoever at all, for the most part, was the raw initiative taken by the hearty mountain people of the local area. They ended up discovering that they had heart, indeed. And some could even fight skillfully, albeit only when they knew the direction and vectoring of an enemy's attack, and if they were behind excellent cover and concealment positions, and also if they moved when they needed to. Being that the Americans were using caves in the mountains and other natural terrain and topographical features as protection, while they also happened for now to know the direction of the attack, this all allowed for them to stay relatively focused and for the ability of how and where to concentrate their efforts within the scope of this particular battle. They continued moving backwards up the mountain, and Bill didn't want to be left behind to fend alone for himself against the massive Ch1com onslaught, now reaching the top of the road. They were obviously preparing their next tactical assault, fully aware that they'd be open targets upon reaching the top of the road, being it was a segment without cover and concealment they'd have to cross to pursue the Americans now moving higher up into the mountains. It had only been mere minutes since Brian had actually been hit and evacuated, but it all seemed so slow to Bill. Within a nearly 10-minute span, all the aforementioned events had all just occurred. And Bill needed to move now or become KIA'd without a shadow of a doubt. Bill then got up and ran towards jutting ground, making a sort of miniature ridgeline of sorts, then took cover after rolling over the top of it and down into a ravine sort of formation. There were others there, as he wasn't alone upon entering the ravine. 8 men in this stretch of terrain were now popping up and shooting, and apparently having been behind Bill's last position in lower terrain behind the road, as he had been in the prone while firing upon the Ch1coms. These were most likely the men that the rockets that sailed above Bill earlier had been actually aimed for, and also were likely even the real reason why the Ch1com forces didn't just charge the road immediately to annihilate Bill, among the others in similar positions. Being that Bill was no tactical genius, he was exceedingly blessed by being around certain others who were more inclined towards such knowledge. They ended up being many such layers of groups in varying terrain features, hiding behind them and shooting down in mutually supporting fire positions, which caused Ch1coms to occasionally become pinned down or hesitate prior to carrying out larger scale assaults or complete charges altogether. They needed to clear the slopes and this type of terrain prior to moving forward. Mortars were already being used for more precise fire support, or occasionally the air or regular artillery strikes for larger, more stubborn trouble spots of Americans. Now these men were realizing that their time was short in terms of staying here where they all now were, As they kept popping up and shooting in random fashion, one was smacked in the head as a round hit him dead center of his forehead, blowing out the back in a mess that would have made the other men vomit had it been daylight hours. The others were, however, undaunted and kept firing. After all, what choice did they even have? It was a nightmare in the truest sense of the word. They'd moved to run uphill when it happened again. "Grenade!" one yelled. Part 19. While the battalion of Pvt Li of the PLA of which Pvt Li of the PLA was a part of, was busy taking their section of the first defense line of the Cap City of America. The strong point being a massive structure tasked to Pvt Li's company within his battalion to clear and capture. The armored battalion belonging to the 93rd Infantry Division of the 31st Group Army, a separate division of the 31st, was already capturing the Supreme Court complex, having punched a massive hole in the first defense line with their state-of-the-art Type 99A main battle tanks and their additional state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry armored vehicles within their battalion. This occurred as battalions within the CAP belonging to the 92nd Infantry Division, which was Pvt Li's battalion's parent unit within the 31st Group Army, was busy within their own sectors of the assault. It was late afternoon on day 2 by this time, and the building being cleared was nearly a 1 kilometer structure, and its enormous size required a company-wide effort, as Pvt Li's company was one of the 8 different companies comprising his whole battalion, moved swiftly through the halls and offices, already having had engaged stragglers, defenders who remained above ground, who hadn't gone into the basement levels during the huge artillery barrage and airstrikes that had occurred just a little earlier. The whole building was a massive monolithic granite and steel reinforced concrete structure in thick layers of such, comprising the floors and walls in terms of the outer granite walls, but also layers of reinforced concrete walls within the floor plan of the interiors. The direct airstrikes and shell hits of the artillery shells had managed to blast large holes in both the walls and also the ceilings, which collapsed in with the blast. Enormous areas of the ceilings and floors all the way down to the 3rd floor. Only the fact that the steel beams and girders kept many areas of the building in relatively stable, kept them relatively stable condition due to the overall structural integrity of the structure. Even a nuke would have done similar to the building, as what was direct, massive conventional strikes had actually managed to achieve. Not unlike the few concrete structures that partially withstood the atomic weapon used at Hiroshima. The second floor, and parts of the third, still somewhat being intact, had to be methodically cleared, which would last into the evening hours. But Americans were coming up from the basement levels now, and Pvt Li's squad moving up the hall in two 5-man stack teams were now engaged in a firefight to move in to seize one of the stairwells. The northern stairwell, as there were 4 within this building in a diamond pattern within the floor plan, along with the elevators, of course, although these were totally out of commission by both a lack of power due to the cyber attacks and also the destroyed upper floors also being a contributing factor. While the firefight was going on, the men heard over their helmet radio sets that troops of the 93rd Armored Battalion had fully seized the Supreme Court complex and have planted both the CCP party flag and the national flag of China atop the structure. News of this caused the men inside capturing this hard point to fight even harder, as the race had been on, with even more determination to attain a rapid victory, as everyone wanted to capture the grand prize, the mall area with all its major key regime buildings. The court was just won, but it was a taste of ultimate victory. It was a whiff of a fine cologne or perfume, the scent of triumph over a soon-to-be vanquished and much-hated foe. Now, the men firing from behind the stairwell door were being forced back, as the volume of fire being laid upon them was becoming far too intense for them to risk exposing themselves around the corners. Coupled with the tandem issue of the number 1 men of each stack team on each side of the hall, also holding ballistic shields from which to protect the fire teams, firing from relative safety standing behind them. One of Lee's squad members, another private, deployed a hand grenade when the opportunity then presented itself. This, as the Americans now disappeared completely from view and thus wouldn't anticipate the grenade. It flew from the number 3 man on the left side of the hall from the left side's stack team. It disappeared into the stairwell, followed by a blast 2 seconds thereafter, and a sense that it had gotten some of them, so to speak. Pvt Li was the number 3 man in the right side stack team and maintained his rifle at the low ready position, on standby to assist either the 2 men to the rear of the stack team or the number 1 and number 2 man who were in front of him. Who he aided hinged upon where enemies attacked from, and how heavily as well. "Move!" yelled the squad sergeant as they moved, clumped together in their stack teams down the hallway, maintaining a high state of alertness and readiness for combat to flare back up at any time. "Drop!" yelled the sergeant, as an AT-4 suddenly protruded from around the corner, whereby the user wasn't exposed, but couldn't see the Ch1coms either in such a position. It seemed like an act of sheer desperation when it then occurred. The blast reverberated throughout the hallway as the recoilless anti-tank shell flew out of the tube, instantly blasting 1 millisecond after being fired as it flew in front of the stack teams of Pvt Li's squad. But fortunately, the ballistic shields absorbed a lot of the shrapnel from the blast as the shell managed to hit a door frame of an office, a concrete door frame, causing much of the blast to actually be diverted away from the squad into the office and the hallway at an angle that sent the shrapnel largely sailing into the walls and not into the stack teams themselves. "Kill that son of a bitch!" yelled the squad sergeant in a rage after regaining his composure from the momentary disorientation caused by the blast. 2 men now deployed grenades again into the stairwell. They didn't realize it, but the first one they tossed went down initially further to the basement level 1's entryway, claiming 2 who had earlier retreated and badly maimed another, although the AT-4-wielding defender came down from floor number 2, running down the steps after the original grenade had blasted. This time, however, the grenades managed to get the AT-4 operator, who now stood on floor number 1's stairwell. "Move!" once again yelled the sergeant, as the team moved to the entryway of the stairwell, with the right side team moving in to clear the stairwell tactically before yelling "clear" for the other team within the squad to move in behind them to climb the stairs to floor 2, whereas other squads of the other 4 platoons, comprising the company's 4 combat platoons, excluding its headquarters platoon outside in the vehicles, taking other sections of the building's basement, as well as also top floors. It was a mammoth structure, and fortunately, there was only 1 wounded in action, Ch1com, while capturing it, but it was mild. Still, though, it hadn't been fully cleared just yet, and the upper floors and basements would prove more daunting of a challenge than even was floor number 1. The sounds of war could still be heard from all over the metro area as air, artillery, and other ground forces let everyone know without a doubt that they were still there and not going anywhere. The defenders, who held no illusions and knew they were to be defeated, also realized there was really no other options but to continue going until they couldn't go anymore. It was a hell of a predicament to be caught in, and one which became exceedingly stressful to exist within for all parties involved, but particularly, though, on the American side of things. The aggressor was becoming more exhilarated and jubilant and motivated, knowing that victory was so close, and that their new hybrid war doctrines proved vastly superior to the old ways of waging wars, in which most armies were accustomed to, with the Trojans being the keystone to such a rapid victory. Other squads clearing the upper levels, in addition to the squad of which Pvt Li was a part of, radioed in their findings and overall location within the building itself, as the various different squads of each of the 4 platoons within Pvt Li's company all moved through the structure like a well-oiled machine, steadily moving through hallways and the mammoth single rooms with multiple desks inside of former employees of the department, as well as the smaller offices as well, clearing each room with the stack teams. Some contained hidden defenders trying to take cover. However, many did not. This being due in part to the massive artillery and airstrikes that struck the building and surrounding areas, having driven many for cover into the two basement levels below the mammoth, monolithic, reinforced structure. Outside, the vehicles of the company laid waste to Americans trying to hide in the windows, who tossed grenades and Molotovs, and even fired a couple AT-4 anti-tank weapons out of such hiding places from up in the higher floors of the building, wherever they could find solid ground to actually stand on. This due to the gutted structure not being fully stable in many areas that had been hit by various types of ordinances, which, having managed to score direct or near direct hits, caused certain areas to be shaky at best. The defenders missed their mark, but did manage to damage the tracks on one of the armor personnel carriers waiting outside via an AT-4 striking the roadway to the side of one of its tracks. This required the company's maintenance squad of the headquarters platoon to spring into action to conduct a rapid track repair operation, with the spare track sections kept on hand for such situations. The men continued through the building, and shortly after Private Li's squad had reached the second floor, had encountered a large, spacious office room wherein the Americans had fired at them from behind the relative cover and concealment of desks and arranged in piles, mixed with chairs strewn about the room as obstacles to impede movement, amid collapsed sections of ceiling from upper floors from where the heavy artillery and airstrikes occurring before the raid happened upon the structure, thus having softened it up for Li's company to rapidly enter and seize control of the vital strong point on the first defensive line. "Double wedge, go! Bound and cover! Clear the room!" yelled the squad's sergeant of Li's squad, with he leading the right side stack team, now forming into a wedge formation, with the corporal, the second in command of the squad, leading the left side five-man stack team into another wedge formation. Both took cover behind segments of collapsed reinforced concrete segments, having earlier had been blasted down to the second floor from the above floors. Hand grenades were cooked first, then deployed, meaning men held onto them for 2 seconds prior to tossing them so as to not allow the defenders to potentially toss any back at them in return towards the Ch1coms of Li's squad. One of the other privates deployed his Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade system from being slung behind his back, loading up an anti-personnel fragmentation round, before then rising up from behind cover and sending the rocket sailing over enemy positions toward a concrete support beam behind them, thus upon its detonation causing it to crash into the concrete support beam and frag the Americans taking cover from behind a pile of desks, who had first tried to fire at Private Li's squad with an M249 light machine gun and several standard M16A4 assault rifles. Several Several were instantly KIA'd by the rocket, but there were others within the large room to contend with, hiding in other sections of the massive common office chamber. Another private who wielded a QBJ-95 light machine gun began to let it rip in bursts. This, as the right side team that formed into one of the now two current wedge formations within Private Lee's 10-man squad, minus the two left outside in the vehicle, both the driver and the turret gunner on the squad's armor personnel carrier, and thus began to bound towards cover. As Private Lee's left wedge provided covering fire in support for the right wedge to bound forward. This predictively kept the Americans' heads down to avoid the hail of lead coming at them from Private Lee's team, as it came their time to bound ahead of the right wedge team in a leapfrog type of pattern of said bounding and covering. The right team stopped and laid down their covering fire as the left team prepared to bound ahead of them. The Americans now conducted a pray and spray methodology, whereby they held their rifles above them from behind their cover positions to fire without even aiming. This to avoid being hit by the now high volumes of firepower being employed against them. Another two hand grenades were deployed, causing one American to become KIA'd who didn't move out of the way fast enough, and also caused four more to become wounded who tried to escape the blast radius. These men laid on the ground currently, three of which were peppered with shrapnel and were bleeding profusely. The other one of the four who were hit was now mortally wounded, having had caught a piece of shrapnel in his neck, which, while barely missing his brainstem and thus not wiping him out on the spot, was hit mere millimeters from it and tore out a chunk of flesh, whereby he was aspirating on his own blood and drowning in it. Upon Private Lee and his left side wedge reaching cover, they began to lay down fire support for the right side team to bound next. The right wedge made its way forward, with one of the other privates within that team taking a hit to the chest in his body armor, which caught him off guard and caused him a sharp pain in his chest, likely similar to what Private Lee had earlier experienced in the bridge battle by the Anacostia River at the end of day one going into day two. The sergeant immediately radioed in combat medics to both check on the private who was just hit, as per standard operating procedure, but also to tend to the injured Americans, now turned prisoners of war, as the right side wedge fire team now had reached their positions. They would need to maintain their position until medics arrived, leaving the left side team to do one last bound ahead of the right team, which kept firing from their current position, which tactically would put more space between the hostiles still firing upon them, which remained in this large chamber, and the right side team, which was now awaiting the arrival of the combat medics. However, the situation now changed drastically, as one of the other squads within the same platoon as Private Lee's squad, which ambushed the defenders from behind, came out of another hallway. This effectively ended the firefight. And also news came in that another platoon entered the third floor, which mostly didn't even exist anymore as an actual whole floor per se. This being due to the whole ceiling above it being essentially gone, leaving only subsections of partial interior walls still remaining, with not very much left above them. There, however, was ruins that still led to the top of one side of the building's outer walls, collapsed portions of the ceilings mostly, which was how the CCP flag of the party and the national flag of China were both planted atop the wall to signify the official capture of the American strongpoint. Despite these actions having had just occurred, there were still ample amounts of enemies hiding in the basements. But the two other platoons that stayed on the first floor had largely seized control of all the stairwells leading to the basement levels, thus maintaining control of choke points that prevented those hiding in the basement levels from joining in the battle. 2 more hours went by, and those in the basement, seeing no way out, began surrendering en masse. However, enterprising men among them found a maintenance tunnel entrance connecting the basement level 2, the lowest basement level, to a labyrinth of other tunnels and sewers, and even the metro line below the structure. However, this was discovered relatively last minute, as there were massive quantities of junk and stored furniture, as well as boxes and cabinets of files and paper, all cluttering the basements, thus having blocked the passageway out of the basement level 2, which this passageway was found by the time of the other Americans surrendering, which itself was a hot-button issue amongst the defenders as confusion and panic sunk in upon the blockage of the stairwells by Ch1com troops, who began slaughtering all who dared show their faces out of the door and into the stairwell. The medics had arrived, checking on the other private of Pvt Li's squad who was hit, now dispatching meds to him, while medevacing the wounded American enemy POWs as well. The PLA had already long been busy elsewhere with other objectives before even the first defense line had fully even been completely wiped out by late on day 2. The headquarters company, a Pvt Li's whole battalion of mechanized infantry, had moved into the Supreme Court complex, having recently been captured earlier on day 2, now taking up residence there to direct operations for their battalion forces. Also using the structure to truck in logistics closer to the battle lines from CCP properties recently used beyond city limits as logistical bases, now that the next phase of the operation would begin, whereby the final defense lines were to be assaulted and rapid effective resupply would be required to bring the battle to a quick and decisive closure. The one armored battalion belonging to the 93rd Infantry Division of the 31st Group Army had redeployed to the southeast and into the eastern suburbs to bring that area of stiff resistance within the metro area as a whole to a quick close, as the battalions of the 92nd Infantry Division of the 31st Group Army would go further into the Cap City proper to defeat the 2nd Defense Line before finally defeating the 3rd and final defense line surrounding the mall area and encasing the decision-making center of the very enemy regime itself. This was the grand ultimate prize that the CCP regime in Beijing had long since coveted for itself. The propaganda forces stayed at the ready. This, as propaganda was the highest priority in China, as this was beyond the scope of merely being the biggest single invasion in all of human history. No, besides simply just being that, it was the ultimate propaganda opportunity as well that would be remembered forever. This was the prideful land meeting its final demise to the Chinese and also to much of the world, who all felt this sentiment. To them, this was the equivalent of the sickle and hammer of the former USSR's flag flying over the Reichstag in Berlin. Nazi Germany was the prize of its day, and now in this time period it was America, and its very cap city. China's flags already flew over large portions of it. By the second day of this epic, massive invasion, soon they indeed would reach their final conclusion of their efforts. However, in the meantime, Pvt Li's company was being deployed to the direct south to conduct its assault on the second defense line. They were to assist Belarusian forces moving north along their narrow battle lines along I-295 to meet them close to the Anacostia River, the AO given to the battalion of which Pvt Li served within. The key node of the second defense line in this particular area was a thin stretch of area that consisted of the St. Elizabeth's Hospital complex. The medieval appearing architecture that was originally a psych hospital but contained the headquarters of one of the biggest paramilitary entities of the American side, namely the DHS. They were reinforced with local National Guard units of the DC area, mostly support elements. They're helping them to hold their portion of the line. The Belarusians from the south were coming in hard. They came in with their armored battalion and one mechanized infantry battalion from their 11th Brigade, having had left two other mechanized infantry battalions in other areas along their narrow defense lines further to the south, where the rest of their brigade was now sitting by Quantico, recently captured by them. The other two mechanized infantry battalions that had headed north from Quantico held other sectors facing east towards the now being captured eastern suburbs, being taken by battalions of the PLA's 93rd Infantry Division, and also within the recently captured naval installation on the Potomac. Pvt Li's battalion of the 92nd PLA Infantry Division was moving south to break the back of the second defense line in this particular sector, which would allow for a general link-up between the forces moving north of the Belarusians and those headed south towards the inner two defense lines of the inside the city proper itself, belonging to the PLA's forces. The stubborn defenses within the eastern suburbs upon the 93rd's tank forces being added into the mix, along with heavy artillery and heavy airstrikes and strategic munitions dropping, mixed in with the mechanized infantry battalions assaulting their own specific sectors from east of the metro area into the easternmost suburbs, all served to cut off the eastern suburbs from the rest of the city that remained still within American hands, intending to squeeze the eastern suburbs into submission before going in finally for the final blow itself. Pakistani forces of the 17th Lancers Regiment across the Potomac River to the general southwest were completing their seizure of the Arlington National Cemetery Heights by this time, giving them the ultimate artillery position upon the heights, as well as also capturing the Reagan National Airport, leading essentially to the final fall of the western side of the entire metro area. The remaining forces on that side were scrambling now to flee across the river before trying to blast key bridges to the bottom of the river to prevent crossing by Pakistani forces into the city center itself, which was defended by the last two remaining defensive lines. One bridge would be left linking both sides of the city across the Potomac. The bridgehead on the southwest side of the river, however, would be heavily reinforced with troops and was expected to hold on for perhaps another day or maybe two at the very most, depending on how long other sections of the remaining metro area would likewise also be able to hold out. Thrust into new battle, Pvt Li and his company, of which he served within, had resupplied in the several hours following their victory over the strong point they'd completed capturing within the first defensive line. They'd used the time to refuel, rearm, and quickly ate and drank plenty of water prior to their redeployment, as day two now drew to a close. Already having been nighttime and headed southbound through the nearly empty, albeit rubble-strewn streets laying behind the first defense line that they had just taken. They arrived just an hour before midnight, just as a savage battle for the halls of the massive headquarters building of the American DoD was occurring across the Potomac, as the Pakistanis were given the honor of its capture. The battalion of Pvt Li was being thrust towards the large St. Elizabeth's complex, another large headquarters type area of sorts, but of American paramilitary as opposed to the regular military. The forces fighting in this particular area, however, began to inflict massive losses upon the invading forces for once, being a drastically better prepared defense line than even the first defense line was, being a drastically shorter defense line in length, allowing for a much higher concentration of defenders within that line, as it was many kilometers shorter than even the first was. The forces guarding the eastern suburbs, however, were surprisingly well equipped by the time of the invasion's initiation, largely being due to all the guard armories in this section of the city, coupled with the paramilitary elements being close by at their headquarters at St. Elizabeth. The naval and even air forces as well. They put up the fight of their lives from the defenders' perspective of things, having held back their most effective weapons in bigger quantities for the second and third lines of defense, but largely concentrating most of what they had left on this next to last defense line, as the third and final line was mostly a fallback point for the final stand, the last defense of the city itself. Although forces held it as early as the end of day 2, anticipating the final stand to come somewhat rapidly, despite this being mostly the case, fighting as a whole would grind on for nearly another 2 days, with the official surrender agreement for the American regime occurring within the next 37 hours from 11 p.m. at the end of day 2. It would take nearly a whole day to penetrate the second defense line, as it would prove to be the most formidable of all the American defense lines. By the end of day number 2, Sgt Richardson of the American side had been recognized beneath the city within the underground shelters within the metro line for the military, its logistics, and of course refugees all combined into one within this subway system beneath the city. He had been recognized by officers returning to underground cover to rest and eat, or otherwise simply recuperate from the hellish combat unfolding now above the grounds. Truly an indescribable nightmare. They'd realized he was of the 704th Military Intelligence Brigade, a unit that had been totally annihilated and no longer existed on paper, apart from the rarity of survivors who made their way in different directions from the large battle having had occurred at their home installation, having taken place on day 1, namely the large battle at Fort Meade as the Ch1coms were clearing the hinterlands of American defense forces prior to their entry of the metro area itself. Those who survived this particular subset of the entire campaign, who had managed to flee, were largely KIA'd, killed in action, or captured, save those who managed to flee safely within the city itself, either before or during the initial major actions having had unfolded of the invasion, whereby the first PLA units entered the outermost suburbs of the city. It was thus a truly all-hands-on-deck moment for the Americans, and required all the help they could feasibly get when it came to the common defense of the regime's stronghold of D.C. Sgt Richardson's unit now became a defunct force, which now landed him a new job in communications, if it could be called such, which entailed him being essentially a messenger or runner, so to speak. This new position allowed for him to contact higher ranking officers of various defending forces throughout the city for the sole purpose of spreading orders or carrying messages to other ranking leaders, thereby keeping lines of communication open. A vital mission, although it was an agonizingly slow, grueling task. He was given a dirt bike for this task to allow for a more speedy progress when it came to the message delivery, to be able to travel more quickly across what remained of the city. Already a highly perilous task. There was to be 5 messenger runners for every single solitary one message. That way, if one, or even possibly even 4 at the most, perished, there would still at least be one who got the message through to its intended recipient. Although highly risky, it allowed for Sgt Richardson himself to see aspects of the defense, its leaders, and generally war as a whole that others would never truly know of. Should history look back upon this, he would be the sort of man that history documentary filmmakers would be actively seeking out in order for such insights, to have truly the full picture of the last events on the defenders' side of things, much like those who were within Hitler's inner circle in the dying days of his regime, there to witness the very end of Nazi Germany. Sgt Richardson's first task was to deliver news of the recent fall of the first defense line to commanders on the defense line 2's key nodes, which were a handful of different strong points along this defense line. This due to news of the last strong points on the first line rapidly having capitulated or were taken altogether in brutal pitched battles where the defending forces went all in, committing fully to holding largely to the last man in some cases. Messengers fleeing these areas as they fell delivered the messages to the headquarters at the Pentagon, which itself, recently within hours of getting the news, finished its actual relocation to the new command post at the Jefferson Memorial, whereby the head of the Joint Chiefs set up his headquarters as other members of the Chiefs were delegated to command different positions of the last remaining defense lines personally, as the buck stopped with these men on all levels of the unraveling situation, similar to the types of things that happened in Berlin at the end of World War II. Besides that point, many subordinates within the metro area and in the first day within the outer ring of installations, which originally surrounded the metro area itself, had all either been KIA'd or captured by this point, leaving really, truly, no competent command structure apart from whosoever remained within the DoD's headquarters at the Pentagon by late on day 2, as Pakistani shells began to rain down on it. As the naval installation along the Potomac had fallen earlier in the same day as well. The lack of field grade officers of the '04 to '06 pay grades remaining, apart from adjutants and the like within the Pentagon itself, led to the generals having to, in effect, step in to take control of the defensive situation personally in terms of coordinating the entire effort. The political leadership, along with some of their uber rich handlers within the city, were about to have a rude awakening as the PLA and their allies were actively seeking them, having already had captured what they themselves considered HVTs, which were high value on their list of priority captures. The regime leadership itself hid within bunkers, which now sat directly beneath the third defense line, which itself incorporated the presidential residence, the CAP building, among other similar structures, which had such pre-designated as parts of the defense line for such a time of conflict, albeit it had never been anticipated to be happening upon American soil. But they sufficed as a Hitler-esque sort of underground bunker complex in a somewhat last days of Berlin type of situation. The atmosphere within such places was very similar to that within the Führer bunker, in that there was a constant anxiety, fear of capture, and generally a light panic. An anticipation that their near future wouldn't be quite ideal, if it could be said in such a way, at the hands of China. A nation and a people and an ideological base in the form of the CCP, which would grant them no mercy, and that was a well understood fact by this point, evident by the destruction that could be seen all around them. Sgt Richardson had taken the message first to one of the other hardened strongpoints which sat on the second defense line, another former department headquarters building, now largely flattened into unidentifiable rubble, although the rubble itself, which now began to serve as an ideal defensive structure, as there were now some ample hiding spots within such rubble to hide and post up such defensive arms as anti-tank weapons and machine gun nests. Next, he was off to what would soon then become another active battlefield, as other messengers took other parts of their messages to other areas along the second defense line. He was never asked to enter the eastern outer suburbs, which sat further to the east of the second defense line, namely outside of its perimeter, now being squeezed, who had in their area held out among the longest apart from the city center, which was protected by the different defense lines, and also a tiny bridgehead on the southwest of the Potomac River, which was now heavily reinforced to prevent Pakistani forces from crossing into the mall area. No, rather, Sgt Richardson's services were mainly confined within the area of the easternmost parts of the north-facing second defense line's perimeter. He now, upon relaying the message to the first lines of the first line's fall to his first destination on the second line to prepare them for the imminent PLA assault on the second line that they all knew was soon to strike, now began to head out on his dirt bike to the toll bridge across the Anacostia over to the southeasternmost part of the city proper, where the easternmost node of the second defense line lay, namely the St. Elizabeth's complex. En route to the bridge, it was an eerie sort of calm of sorts. Yes, although artillery was now somewhat slowed to sporadic strikes here and there, instead of full-on heavy barrages like had been the case for most of the battle thus far, it was mostly much more quiet overall than it had been up till then. As he neared the bridge, he was driving behind American positions on the second line itself, whereupon sat rubbled machine gun nests intermixed with sandbags, and also anti-tank missile nests of the same designs, and also barriers before them, constructed with all kinds of rubble, with intermixed concertina wire, mixed with also destroyed vehicles pushed into tall piles to impede any progress of the Ch1com vehicles and to create choke points by which they could be hopefully easily managed, with the being done with using the remaining backhoes and other similar types of construction equipment which had somehow managed to barely survive all the ordinances and payloads dropped on the city, be it by artillery or airdropped. And it did seem all quite imposing in terms of defensive structures and capabilities. The first line, although having had been 1 kilometer deep in depth and having had snaked a long distance around the city, did not have this many men to defend it all concentrated within one zone. Nor did it seem this well put together overall, as it was apparent that more time was afforded to build up this area, as well as even Defense Line 3, behind the second defense line. The men were all very silent, always anticipating Ch1com probing assaults or overt night attacks with much heavier concentrated forces. But there were none, just yet. It was eerie, indeed. Sgt Richardson thought to himself upon passing barriers and fortified areas, and even a checkpoint on the bridge as he crossed to the other side of the Anacostia. This is it. They're resupplying before their big push. Shit. I hope I can get back underground again before their opening artillery barrage and airstrikes. This is going to be nasty, he thought to himself as he reached the other side of the bridge, passing another fortified checkpoint on the other side. Upon turning onto the highway a short distance before quickly exiting again off the battle-damaged road, he entered the complex through its entrance, passing the massively fortified but ruined yards and sparsely wooded positions of dug-in areas. Now a splintered park of ruined and damaged trees and gardens and ripped up lawns from the combo of shells and rockets and also airdrop munitions that landed in certain areas, but also from all of the digging in that had occurred here to create defensive positions mixed in with it. The American defenders were very well dug in this area as it stood. Sgt Richardson, asking directions upon reaching a roadside bunker on the way into the compound, had been directed towards the commander's bunker quarters to deliver the message, which indicated that they needed to prepare immediately for the next upcoming imminent Ch1com assault. These men hadn't yet received word of the first defense line's fall, which was why Sgt Richardson badly needed to deliver the message, as there were no radio communications or any other such ways to know. A single paper drafted upon a simple typewriter and stamped with official seals and signatures indicating authenticity was what indicated that the letter of the message was authentic. No computers worked, so it was back to low-tech means, of course. Yes, he needed to make it out before things got ugly. But could he? It sure wasn't up to him, ultimately. He hoped that he could. He made his way down the winding roads of the complex en route to the commander of the defending forces, numbering some nearly 500 within the sprawling campus. The defending American forces were mostly a motley crew of a mix of various types of different military personnel of 3 different branches, including the local guard elements, but also Air Force and Naval forces being present as well among them, as well as even being intermixed with paramilitary forces from Homeland Security elements within their SWAT armor and associated tactical SWAT weaponry. There were effectively no longer any vehicles present aside from simple all-terrain vehicles and a couple remaining up-armored Humvees with their turret gunners on guard duty in key choke points along the road. There to be a mobile guard force to aid the various fortified guard posts, checkpoints, and other close-by recently dug primitive bunker systems closer to the roads. The main headquarters building, while badly damaged, did manage to avoid being completely annihilated, largely due to Ch1com air and artillery forces trying to avoid hitting the bridges and major highways along the riverside close to where the structure itself happened to sit on the campus. This so they could use the bridges to cross to take the battle deeper into the city, across the Anacostia. He parked his dirt bike upon arriving. He checked in then with the door guards who allowed him passage upon him showing his ID card, his military ID, as well as the written orders officially stamped and signed by the city's DOD command structure, which designated him as a delegated messenger. Upon given clearance to enter the medieval-looking facade of the structure, passed through its lobby, and walked past a machine gun emplacement made of sandbags, which was actually indoors within the entryway, before passing other forces all walking to and fro, prior to finding the stairwell which led into the basement itself. This was where he was told the local commanders were, both the paramilitary commander, but also the Army Brigadier General who originally came from the Pentagon, who was given command over the area's defenses. This unusual situation called for unusual procedures, to say the least, given the fact that a brigadier general in regular terms would have realistically been given overall command over a full brigade, which itself would be quite a bit more men than was this understrength battalion worth of men that was holding this area, if it could even be called a battalion, as it was a mix of various forces involved at St. Elizabeth's complex. Just as he arrived shortly thereafter, within the basement, it then initiated. Shells had begun to rain close by, somewhere outside. Sgt Richardson didn't quite know how close, but it was a massive barrage once again. Possibly a preparatory barrage for another strike, another push into defense line number 2, the second ring, and the next to last belt of the city's overall defenses. He was practically late in delivering the message, as the artillery itself essentially signified the beginning of such an assault. However, he did his delegated job the best he was able to. After all, it wasn't as if messengers or runners had the realistic ability to be as fast as instantaneous radio, telecommunication, or computer-based communications. He then made his way down the hall towards the briefing room for the defensive command to relay his message. End of part 19. Thank you all for coming.